Hello, it's Friday, and that means another edition of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. And as always, I'm John, and I'm here with my son and the managing partner of John Zogby Strategies, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm good, thanks. Let's jump right in.
Yeah.
Okay, something I want to talk about, and I think only from conversations during the week, an issue that you want to talk about. But, last week we were coming right off of Nikki Haley's announcement to run for the Republican nomination. We alluded to it. And in fact, there was a great article about our conversation in the Washington Examiner, which, if you folks are on our list, you probably are. We're going to send it around, and it'll be posted on our website. But I wanted to follow up with that and talk about Republican Party politics going into 2024 and getting an understanding of how high the stakes are. Not about any 1, 2, 3, or 5 persons, not about even the heart and soul of the party itself, but just where the party exists and what the battle is over, at least as I, and I'm sure a few other pundits, see it. So here, broadly speaking, is what we're talking about. Democratic Party has, and we've talked about this many times, it has the progressive wing, been around for a very, very long time, and it has the moderate liberal but establishment wing. And those have been hotly contested and very close for Democratic nominations on the presidential level, but also congressional and U.S. Senate levels as well. What do we have in the Republican Party today? Well, the dominant player in the Republican Party today is the MAGA movement, led by Donald Trump. I can't say created because its godfather, I think you would say, would be Pat Buchanan, going back to 1992. Maybe even some elements of Ross Perot, even though he was an independent and didn't run as a Republican. So there are many things that make up this MAGA movement. I mean, not the least of which is the personality of Donald Trump himself. But among the key elements, what we're talking about is, for want of a better word, isolationism, non-interventionism, what we've traditionally called in American history, America first. Let's not get out into any broad ventures overseas. Let's not be the policeman of the world. Let's not rely on traditional allies, NATO and or the United Nations or various other regional alliances. One element of it. Another element of it is protectionism, meaning buy American goods, high tariffs on imports, notably, of course, from China, our major economic competitor. And thirdly is the strong element of, I'm going to call it anti-immigration. You know, they will tell you that it's anti-illegal immigration, but the fact of the matter is the president himself referred to the quality, in quotes, of immigrants that were coming, especially from, you know his term, shithole countries. But basically, building that wall on the southern border and referring to undesirable folks, that's not a new term in our history, undesirable folks from the southern hemisphere and from parts of Asia as well. So that's the MAGA focus. Now, by the same token, the conservative, equally conservative in many ways, is what you might call the Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan conservatism. Barry Goldwater, the godfather of that. Ronald Reagan, the major conservative spokesperson in the United States before he ran for president of the United States. What are elements of Reaganism? Neoconservative foreign policy, interventionism, America as policeman of the world, America as the city upon a hill, the guiding moral force, the promotion of democracy, promotion of alliances. In fact, it hugely expanded military spending. Ironically, the second piece, no special order, of Reaganism is budget hawkism. Reducing the deficit, cutting spending, particularly domestic spending, and ironically, doing that while under his presidency in the first few years, deficits ran to record highs, even considering World War II. Record highs because military spending increased, remember we're talking 40 years ago, increased by $1 trillion. Now, at the same time, tax cuts. And, this had driven people crazy, So on one hand, you reduce domestic spending a bit, dramatically raise military spending, and then cut revenue at the same time. And under Reagan, we had not only Social Security reform, but in the mid-1980s, we had a major reform of immigration and an expansion of legal immigration, first major immigration reform since Jack Kennedy in the mid-'60s. So where do things stack up? You have Ron DeSantis, who by all accounts is going to announce fairly soon, the governor of Florida, who is Donald Trump without the rough edges, a young man, but he's also Donald Trump who has implemented a lot of Trumpism, including a culture war in the state of Florida. And so it's going to be, I guess, Trump versus Trump light on that wing of the party. And now you have Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley, conservative, but more along the lines of the Reagan conservatism. Tax cuts, a moderate on immigration, and very little to do with the culture war. In fact, she is famous for having announced, ordered Confederate flags to be taken down in the immediate aftermath of a horrible church shooting by a white supremacist in Charleston. So, oddly enough, you have two MAGA candidates who are not splitting the vote. They each have their own supporters. Nikki Haley jumps in, and we alluded to this last week. One poll has her at 11%, and all 11% of hers comes off of Ron DeSantis. So this is really kind of a fascinating dynamic and makes you wonder now. We've got a few more possible candidates, not going to spend much time on them, but Mike Pence, where does he fit in? He's already attacking Donald Trump, though he was a loyal supporter of Donald Trump, as was Nikki Haley. And then Tim Scott raises an important issue. African-American U.S. Senator from South Carolina, same state as Nikki Haley. And what's he doing in the race? And he is clearly much more in the moderate, non-MAGA wing of the party. So there's a lot more at stake here than just personalities. And in fact, final point, the former president is already attacking Ron DeSantis unmercifully.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he has welcomed Nikki Haley, his former UN ambassador, although there is a piece out just today, you can find it on Real Clear Politics, in The Spectator, attacking Nikki Haley as the Republican Kamala Harris. And it's not a favorable article, calling her an airhead, overly ambitious, a phony, and someone who was loyal to Donald Trump and is now battling Donald Trump. Got to wonder if there's maybe even a little bit of misogyny in there as well. Otherwise, I have nothing to say.
Yeah. So this is one of those, what do I think?
Oh, yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. I thought about what I said last week I still think that the demographic that would be most interested in Nikki Haley would be the demographic that doesn't want to see more firebrand politics, that wants to return to more of a time of something akin to normalcy. I think, as I've said before, I think that train has left the station. These candidates arrive on the scene in response to the times. One could argue that they shape the times, but I don't think so. I think your Trumps and your DeSantises arrive on the scene because of what's happening. Mm-hmm. And you just look back over the last 10 to 12 years, and it's very tumultuous. I mean, you had the Great Recession. You had, coming from George W. Bush, who started out not very liked as a president, but then went to a 90% approval rating, and then down to something like high 20s, low 30s by the end of his presidency, a manic depressive crash, which led to the excitement of Obama, who won in a landslide majority, but then who he himself left with a low favorable opinion, and as well as some brewing cynicism. Maybe not as bad as George W. Bush, but remember, under Barack Obama, during his presidency, we saw the rise of the Tea Party and the rise of Bernie Sanders. And so what we have here is by and large a considerable number of voters from within both parties, both sides of the aisle, who have just had it, who think that politicians in D.C. don't understand what common people go through, what life is like. Their policies are out of touch. There's more buzzwords. There's big talk, but there's very little execution of anything that really makes people's lives actually better. In fact, that arguably the only lives that are getting better are those who are in the power centers of the United States, whether that's in places like Los Angeles, places like Manhattan, places like D.C., where wealth is continuously generated, but ironically at the same time also have enormous gaps of wealth between the haves and the have-nots. And so a situation like that, I don't think calls for a Mike Pence. I don't think calls for a Nikki Haley. I have yet to see from Nikki Haley anything of a platform that could address this anxiety, this discontent. Make no mistake about it. This is an age of discontent. This is an age of anxiety.
Absolutely.
And that's how you get the Donald Trump. That's how you get the Ron DeSantis. And so it's going to be very difficult for her to fit herself into that, because, yeah, there are moderate voters, but moderate voters aren't concerned about moderate issues. Moderate voters are concerned about inflation. Moderate voters are concerned about crime. Moderate voters are concerned about the environment. And what can Nikki Haley and a Mike Pence do to say I'm the person that can deal with that? You know, Trump built his whole thing on reshoring, bringing the manufacturing capacity back, making the country a manufacturing powerhouse again. I have every reason to think that Ron DeSantis will try to own a similar issue on that. Of course, the Florida economy is doing quite well compared to a lot of other economies, and so it's going to be very difficult for her to position herself in that. Now, you raised an interesting point last week that maybe all that she's doing is vying for a VP run. I think that would be a better chance for her.
So just a couple of brief comments. Again, about Nikki Haley. Two things that she will try to exploit in a positive sense for her is she is a woman, an Asian, Indian, American, and a woman of color. That is certainly something new for the Republican Party. Whether that works enough or not, I don't know, but she's there. The second is, and this has nothing to do with ideology or issues, but the upbeat, optimistic, hope-filled candidate is usually the one that wins. It's the Jeremiah, the one with the dour, lugubrious, that's our word for the day, face, is the one who normally does not get elected, and don't even need a history lesson on that one. And so, you know, in her announcement, there were smiles, there was hopefulness, and then there was even kind of the appeal to women when she said, believe me, I'll fight back against those who attack me, and it hurts a whole lot more when it's a high-heeled shoe or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I know you have something on your mind. We've been talking about it all week. Let's get into it. Talking about a train having left the station.
I'll get into that in a second. I think I just want to elaborate on your point about the optimism versus the Jeremiah. That's interesting, and that's by and large true. But I think if you were to survey Donald Trump's followers, I think you would find that they're very optimistic about him. Okay, if you were to survey DeSantis's followers, I can guarantee you, because of the 60% landslide victory in the recent governor election, that voters are very enthusiastic about him and are optimistic. It may not be the type of optimism that other people see as optimistic, but they believe that he stands up, that he fights for them, and that he will, keep Florida on the right path and keep it off of the wrong track. I think that's inherently optimistic. That's how I perceive it. That's how I interpret it. It doesn't mean that that's what I believe necessarily from my own viewpoint. But this last week was very bizarre. This is a very, very, very bizarre week. I'm going to go on the record and say this is one of the most bizarre weeks I've ever seen in my life. And it kind of dawned on me Super Bowl night when I was flipping through the news and the third flying object was shot down in a week. And this is what I do when I see it. There's a big story. I'll go to CNN, I'll go to Fox, I'll go to ABC, CBS, NBC, and any other one that I can think of, and see if the headlines are all in sync and what's the difference in the way they frame it. And in nearly every one of those, they were outright talking about UFOs. And I'm saying, what world am I living in where we are now in a situation where it has become mainstream to talk about UFOs? Now, I know that it wasn't necessarily suggested that this is extraterrestrial life, although there was interestingly enough, there was a Pentagon fellow who said he wouldn't rule that out. But I'm thinking, this is bizarre. This is absolutely bizarre. And just in the same week, the week before, there was this bombshell news report coming out from, as I mentioned last week, the legendary Seymour Hersh, who said that he received an anonymous tip that the Biden administration were the ones who were behind blowing up the Russian Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Mm-hmm. And there was silence about this. And if you read his lengthy article, I mean, this isn't like whack job conspiracy stuff. This is like, there's aerial footage. There's it was timed with naval operations in the Baltics that are convened between the Polish, the Dutch, and the United States on an annual basis. You had Blinken, our Secretary of State. You had Victoria Nuland, who were all praising this after the pipeline was blown up. It was immediately stated that the Russians did it, and even back then I said to myself, that makes no sense that the Russians would blow up a multi-billion-dollar asset of their own that is a geostrategic position for themselves in all of Europe. But the point is that, well, I'll elaborate a little bit more. I mean, thank God we had a mild winter in Europe. Mm-hmm. If we had a very brutal cold winter in Europe, the Germans would have suffered dearly for that. But this is a huge, news story. In the past, this is the kind of stuff that could have brought down a presidency, and there was a lot of silence about it. Nobody was really talking about it. So far, the only major interview I've heard was from Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!, mm-hmm. the progressive news channel, who interviewed Cy Hersh on it. And so while that's going on, the media is talking about balloons and these unidentified objects that are being shot down. And then amidst all of that, there's this catastrophe in Ohio, mm-hmm. where we don't even know at this point how bad this environmental catastrophe could be. For all we know, this could be the American Chernobyl, mm-hmm. where however many, I don't know, whether it's dozens or 100 train cars that were filled with vinyl chlorine or vinyl chloride were dumped into the land. It may very well have contaminated the soil, the water. Now, mind you, East Palestine, that's the town where the catastrophe happened. That is on the Ohio River. Mm-hmm. The Ohio River, one of the largest rivers in the country, feeds into a number of major rivers. So, there's that. There's where is it going in the air? Has it come here to New York City? I don't know, but I don't want to say there's a media blackout on it, but it's not being prioritized as a major issue. And that really, really bugs me, and that really concerns me, the level of complacency. So I guess what I want to know, and you can react to this, or you could even ask questions in return, but could this become an American Chernobyl? Is this something, coupled with that and the revelations from Seymour Hersh, is this something that could bring down a presidency? And lastly, is this something that should bring down a presidency? I feel that prior presidents would have been brought down by this.
I don't know. I don't know of an instance of something like that, a catastrophe bringing down any presidency in American history. In fact, I'm pretty sure there has not been a case. What concerns me is especially the lack of, I'm not going to say lack of coverage of the train derailment, but I am going to say the low placement of that issue, which matters just as much. If it's the fourth story on the evening news and given a minute, that's not good for the debate, the public conversation. I'm troubled that the Secretary of Transportation, who's already on the hot seat, finds himself talking about unidentified flying objects and not about the train derailment. He's the man in charge. we don't bring down presidents easily. And I know that there have been more impeachments, in the last 25 years than there were in the first 200 years of the country. None of them successful.
Yeah.
So that's a question I think that carries the conversation too far, but I think we all deserve to know a whole lot more about it, and I don't understand why we don't.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'll say, I'll clarify, when I say bring down a presidency, I don't necessarily mean in terms of necessarily an impeachment, but rather that the media turns on the president, and as a result, that fosters greater distrust in the president. I would expect things like this to do that. I mean, I certainly saw that with George W. Bush. I certainly saw that with Donald Trump.
Katrina, for example. Yeah.
Hurricane Katrina, exactly. To my knowledge, there's been no FEMA brought there. There's been whatever other agency.
I have seen the governor, Mike DeWine, by all accounts, a good and wise governor who also was hugely reelected, was congressman, former attorney general of the state, taking the lead on this. And remember, a state has to request.
Yeah.
I don't know that dynamic, but it's Ohio's call, as to whether FEMA comes in or not. So I have to beg, having no more than kind of a cursory, knowledge of the entire issue. That again troubles me.
Yeah.
Why? Because I've read about it. I just don't have a handle on it.
So I'll just bring it full circle on my end, and then you can close. But I said the age of anxiety and the age of discontent, and this is the kind of stuff that look. We live in a world where even though there may be something like a blackout or a low placement in terms of ranking of stories, the information still gets out.
Yeah.
People still find out no matter what. I mean, there's all kinds of platforms, there's all kinds of independent media and different forms of coverage that really anyone with a smartphone or access to internet can get. And so, I mean, my belief is that this is just going to further foster that discontent with from the American people towards the leadership, and the growing sense that they are not capable of dealing with real problems that affect real people a lot.
I'll only end by bringing things full circle that at this moment, the president has a 45% job approval rating. That's high for him. He's been, in the 40 to 43% range, 45%, given the fact there isn't much wiggle room. When you start out with a 42% deficit of people who just hate your guts. So he's at a 45, so he doesn't seem to be hurt by any of this alone, except that when you do the matchups of Biden versus Trump, Biden versus DeSantis, it's immaterial which one leads. Trump leads him by a couple of points. The president leads DeSantis by a couple of points. But they're all polling 40 to 42% against each other, which means that's their base. And there is 18 to 20% who are undecided. Yeah. And that's, I think, what you're looking at here.
Yeah. And I want to bring this in too, because you'll often hear from us in this podcast that we talk about the approval, but I think what we often forget or don't mention is the disapproval rating.
Yeah.
And so while the Real Clear Politics average is either 44 or 45% Of course, there's a margin of error on that, but well, because that's averaging over the last 2 or 3 weeks from multiple polls. We'll say
My
that
45 is this week.
We'll say that's a solid 45. The disapproval is 52 or 53%. Now imagine an election, a presidential election, where president approval was running against president disapproval, and in this case, president disapproval wins by 7 or 8 points. We would call that a landslide.
And the disapprovals for Obama and Trump were a majority almost all the time.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Well, let's leave it at that.
Okay.
Okay.
You got it.
Have a good week. We'll be back.
Yep.